Pull your stool a little closer to the fire, friend. The wood is good tonight. There has been wet weather for most of the past week, and the dead beech on the north side of the trees has had time to dry, and there is plenty of it. We will be warm. We will be warm for some hours yet. Drink your ale. Listen. I have been walking the western country this autumn, between the small towns of the western valleys, and I have been thinking, as I walked, about a story I was told a long time ago. It was told to me by an old man in the corner of a tavern in a town I will not name. He was perhaps 70 when he told it to me, and he had been a carter all his life, and he had carried wool and grain and tanned hides, and sometimes, when the season was right, the small barrels of cider that the southern farms made for the market towns. He had a good name in that country. People trusted him with their goods. He was, I think, the kind of man other men called good without thinking about it. The way you might call a horse good or a road good, meaning that he did what he was meant to do. And he did it without complaint, and he did not surprise you by being other than what you thought he was. He told me this story late in the evening, when the tavern was almost empty, and the fire had gone down to embers, and his ale was unfinished in front of him. He told me that he had carried this story for 50 years, and had told it only to 2 people in all of that time, and that he was telling me because I was a stranger and would not still be there in the morning, and that he wanted, at least once before he died, to say it aloud and have someone hear it. His name was Owen. I will tell you the story the way he told it to me, as much as I can remember. It happened to him when he was 19 years old, in the 3rd autumn of his work as a carter. It happened on the road between his home village and the market town of Dunhalle, 2 days' journey by cart, and it happened at a small ford on a small river that he had crossed perhaps 30 times before that day, and never crossed again after. There is, friend, a kind of place in the world where the rules go thin. I do not know why. I have asked old men and old women in many countries about this, and they have given me many answers, and I do not believe any of them entirely, and I do not disbelieve any of them entirely. Crossroads are one such place, and high passes in mountains, and the thresholds of houses on certain nights of the year, and fords more than most. A ford is a place where the road goes into the water and comes out again on the other side, and there is a moment in every crossing when you are neither on this side nor that side, and the water is moving around you and your horse and your cart, and the world is not what it was a moment before. Most of the time, nothing comes of it. Most of the time, you just get wet and continue on. But sometimes, and this is what the old men and old women all agreed on in their different ways, sometimes someone is waiting at a ford, and they have been waiting a long time, and they have been waiting for you. Listen, Owen left his village on the morning of the 7th day of October, in a year I will not say, with his cart loaded with bales of cured wool from the 4 farms of the upper valley. The wool had been a good year. The bales were tight and heavy and smelled of the lanolin the women had not entirely scrubbed out, and the smell was, Owen said, the smell of his whole childhood, the smell of his mother's hands when she had been at the wool, and the smell of the small drying shed behind his uncle's barn, and the smell of his own clothes in the autumn when he was small. He had loaded the cart the evening before. His horse, an old grey mare named Pell, had been harnessed at first light. He had said goodbye to his mother, who had given him a small loaf wrapped in cloth, and a piece of hard yellow cheese and 3 apples, and to his father, who had said only that the road was good, but that there had been rain, and that he should not push Pell. Owen had nodded. He always nodded when his father said things like that. His father had been a carter before him, and his father's father before that, and the road from the village to Dunhalle was, in some way Owen could not have explained, theirs. The first day was easy. The road was dry in the higher country, and the air was cool, and the leaves had begun to turn on the hills, the great slow turn of October, the long slow yellow on the beach, and the dark red on the oak. Owen ate his bread at midday with Pell drinking from a small stone trough beside a wayside shrine, and he stopped for the night at a farm where a woman he knew slightly let him sleep in her hayloft for the price of a small length of the wool, which was the price his father had taught him to expect. He slept well. He woke before dawn. He ate more bread, watered Pell, and started on the second day. The second day was harder. The road dropped down out of the high country and into the lower valleys, and in the lower valleys it had rained for most of the past week. The road was muddy and rutted, and Pell did not like it, and twice the cart got stuck in the deep wheel tracks of carts that had passed before in the wet, and Owen had to get down and put his shoulder against the cart and push while Pell leaned into the harness. By mid-afternoon, his back hurt and his arms hurt, and his trousers were wet up to the knees and Pell's flanks were trembling slightly, and he was beginning to think that he would not reach Dunhalle by the evening of the third day, which was when the wool factor expected him. He passed, in the early afternoon, a small wayside shrine set into the bank where the road forked toward an upland village. The shrine was an old one, older than the village, older than the road, perhaps. It was a small stone niche, weathered, with a worn carving inside it that might once have been a saint and might once have been something that was not a saint. The country people of that region put small things into wayside shrines. Owen, as his mother had taught him, stopped the cart and walked back to the shrine and looked into the niche. There was a small loaf of barley bread that someone had put there that morning, going dark on the stone. There was a thin copper coin. There was a small bunch of dried herbs tied with a piece of red wool. There was, set carefully at the back of the niche, a child's wooden tarp, painted blue. Owen stood looking at the wooden tarp for a long moment. He did not know why someone had left it there. He hoped it had been a thank offering and not a request, because requests at wayside shrines were usually the kind of thing one made when there was nothing else left to do. He took a small piece of bread from his pack and broke it and laid half of it on the stone of the niche, and he said the small word his mother had taught him to say, and he did not look directly at the carving inside, and he walked back to the cart. Pell had been waiting patiently. She had been to that shrine before. She knew the rhythm of stopping for it. He drove on. A little later in the afternoon, perhaps 2 hours before the inn at Bram-on-the-Stream, he passed another carter coming the other way. The man was old, older than Owen's father, and he was driving a small two-wheeled cart with a single bay horse, and he was carrying empty crates and the smell of old apples. He was, Owen thought, on his way back from the Oram cider trade. They stopped on the road in the way carters do, side by side with their carts pointing in opposite directions, and the man said good afternoon, and Owen said good afternoon, and they spoke for a few minutes about the road and the weather and the prices at Dunhalle. The man was friendly. He had an open face and laughed easily. Toward the end of their conversation, the man asked where Owen was bound that night. Owen said Bram-on-the-Stream. The man nodded. He said, in the casual way men say things they are not sure they should say, and the day after, the road on through Wen. Owen said yes, the road through Wen. The man was silent for a moment. He looked past Owen at the road behind him, at the high country Owen had come down out of that morning. Then he said in the same casual voice, "It's a high water at Wen, higher than I've seen in years. I'd cross it before noon if I were you." Owen said he would. He said it would depend on the road in the morning. He said he could not promise. The man nodded again. He said, "Cross it before noon, lad, and don't stop on the far side." He clicked his tongue at his bay horse, and the cart moved on, and Owen watched him go for a moment, and then he too clicked his tongue at Pell, and they continued. He thought, as he drove, that two people had now told him not to stop on the far side of the ford at Wen. He thought that this was a thing people said in that country, the way people in some countries said asterisk, "Don't sleep with your feet to the door asterisk," the way people in some countries said asterisk, "Don't whistle indoors after dark asterisk." He thought it was probably superstition. He thought it was probably nothing. He thought all of this in the careful way that a young man thinks something when he is trying to decide whether the older men around him are right about something he has not yet experienced. He decided that he would cross before noon if he could, and that he would not stop on the far side, but that he would not let it worry him either way. He was a carter. The road was the road. The work had to be done. He came to the village of Bram-on-the-Stream a little before dusk. It was a small village, perhaps 15 houses around a small green and a small stone church and a small inn, and the inn had a stable for travellers' horses and a small loft where carters slept, and Owen had stopped there before. The innkeeper, a stout dark woman named Hilda, knew him by sight. She gave him a bowl of bean stew and a slice of dark bread and a cup of small ale, and asked after his mother, and asked whether the wool had been a good year, and Owen said that it had been a good year. The bales were tight, and Hilda nodded and said that was good. The year had been hard for some. He asked her while she was clearing the bowls about the road. He said the road had been wet today, and he was worried about the third-day stretch. Hilda stopped clearing for a moment. She said, slowly, "The road to Dunhalle from here is mostly good. It's the ford at Wen that I'd watch." Owen knew the ford at Wen. It was a small crossing on a small river, perhaps 12 paces wide in normal weather, with a stone bottom that you could feel through the wheels of the cart. He had crossed it many times. It had never given him trouble. He said so. Hilda said, "It's higher than it should be. 2 of the men from the village were down there yesterday, and they said it's running fast and the stones are slick. They said you can still cross it, but they said you should cross it before dusk and not after, and you should cross it without stopping." Owen had nodded. It was good advice. He had always been good at taking advice. He had asked her, and this is the part Owen remembered most clearly 50 years later, whether she had ever heard of anyone having trouble at the ford. He had asked it the way a young man asks a question, half wanting an answer and half wanting to be told there was nothing to it. Hilda had not answered for a moment. She had looked past him at the fire. Then she had said, "There are some fords, Owen, where you should not stop. That is one of them. Cross it and keep going. Don't stop on the far side until you are at least a mile up the road. Do you hear me?" He had heard her. He had said yes, of course, he had heard her, and he had thanked her for the stew. And he had gone up to the loft and laid down on the straw with his coat over him, and he had slept badly, and he had dreamed. He told me this 50 years later in the corner of the tavern. He had dreamed that he was in the middle of the river at Wen, and that the water was up to the bed of the cart, and that something was sitting on the wool bales behind him in the cart, and that he could not turn around to look at it, and that he had to keep driving because if he stopped, even for a moment, the something would put a hand on his shoulder. He woke early. He had ale and bread, paid Hilda, harnessed Pell, and was on the road by dawn. The third day was clear. The clouds had broken in the night, and the morning was cold and bright, and the road was firmer than it had been the day before, the wet beginning at last to dry. Owen was in good spirits. Pell trotted along well. They covered the morning's distance easily. By mid-morning they had passed the small farms south of Bram-on-the-Stream, and by noon they were in the wooded country before the river. And Owen sat on the cart, eating his last apple and watching the road unspool ahead of him through the trees. And he was a young man, and the work was honest, and the day was clear, and he did not, for the most part, think about the dream. He came to the ford at Wen in the late afternoon. The light was wrong by then. The day had been clear in the morning, but a low cloud had come in from the west during the afternoon, the way it does in that country in October, and the sun behind the cloud had become a pale silver disk, and the woods on either side of the road had become darker than they should have been at that hour. The trees were beech, mostly, with some oak, and a few of the small dark yew that grow in that part of the country. The road went down a slope toward the river, and on either side of the road the ground was thick with the brown leaves of the beeches and the dark, wet moss of October. Owen had come down the slope toward the ford, and he had seen, from a distance, 2 things at once. and he had felt the second of them before he understood what it was. The first thing he saw was the river. Hilda had been right. It was higher than he had ever seen it. It was running fast, brown with the runoff of the past week's rain, and the small stone causeway that you usually crossed by, a low pavement of flat stones laid into the riverbed by some unknown people in some unknown time, was almost completely under the water. He could see the line of it, just below the surface, by the way the water broke over it. He thought, as a carter would think, that he could probably still cross. The water was perhaps a foot deep over the stones. Pell could pull through that. The cart would get wet, but the wool would not. He would lose perhaps a quarter hour of time. The second thing he saw, and the thing he felt before he understood it, was the man at the ford. There was a stone on the near bank of the river, just to the left of where the road went down into the water. It was a large stone, perhaps the size of a sitting man's body, and it was old, moss-grown, weathered, set into the bank in the way that old stones get set into banks over centuries. Owen had stopped at this stone before. He had eaten his lunch on it twice. It was the kind of stone that one stops at without thinking. There was a man sitting on the stone. The man was tall, and he was wearing a long, dark, hooded cloak, the kind that pilgrims sometimes wore in those days, the kind with a deep hood that came forward over the face. The cloak was wet at the hem, where it had touched the bank. The man was sitting very still. His hands were folded in his lap. His face was hidden in the hood. He did not move when Owen came down the slope. He did not move when Pell, who had a horse's sense for these things, slowed her pace without being told. He simply sat on the stone in his long, dark, wet cloak and waited. Owen brought the cart to a stop perhaps 10 paces from the stone. He looked at the man. The man did not look at him. The man looked, as far as Owen could tell from the angle of the hood, at the river. Owen called out a greeting. He used the formal greeting that travelers used in that country in those years. The greeting that means * good road and dry feet to you *. He used it because it was what one used. The man did not answer for what Owen later remembered as a long time. Long enough that Owen began to think that the man was deaf, or that he was a foreigner who did not speak the language of that country, or that he was, and this was the thought that came into Owen's mind, and that he did not entirely push out, not a man at all, but only the shape of a man, and that there was nothing inside the shape that would answer him. Then the man spoke. His voice was low and even and entirely human, and Owen was, for a moment, ashamed of his thoughts. The man said, in the language of that country, and with no accent at all, that he was glad to see a traveler. He said that he had been waiting at the ford for some time. He said that he had no horse, and that he could not cross the river on foot at this water, and that he had been waiting for someone with a horse and a cart who might carry him across. He said all of this in a calm and ordinary voice. He did not turn his head. Owen, who was 19 years old, and who had been raised by his mother to help travelers, said that he could of course carry the man across. The water was high, but Pell was strong, and the cart was empty enough at the front behind the seat for one man to sit. He said it would be no trouble. He said that the man should climb onto the cart, and they would cross together. The man on the stone did not move for another moment. Then he stood. He stood in one slow motion, without using his hands, the way a tall man stands when he has been sitting a long time. Owen, watching him stand, had the thought that he had been on that stone for longer than the afternoon. He had the thought, and he could not say where it came from, that the man had been on that stone for many years. The man walked to the cart. His feet made no sound on the leaves of the road, which was strange because the leaves were dry, and dry leaves crackle. Owen heard nothing. The man came around to the side of the cart. He did not climb up onto the seat beside Owen, which is what Owen had expected him to do. He climbed instead onto the back of the cart, onto the bales of wool, and sat down on the bales facing forward, with his back to the front of the cart, so that he would be facing Owen's back as Owen drove. Owen, on the seat, felt the cart shift very slightly under the weight of the man. He did not turn around to look. He took up the reins and he clicked his tongue at Pell, and Pell, who had been standing very still with her ears back, did not move. Owen clicked his tongue again. Pell took a step forward slowly, and then another, and then she was walking down the last of the slope toward the water, and Owen could feel the weight of the man behind him, and he could feel something else as well, a coldness, a draft of cold air at the back of his neck, even though there was no wind in that wooded country, and the day, though cool, was not that cold. He drove Pell into the water. The river took the wheels of the cart. The water came up around Pell's hocks, and the cart dipped and rose with the rough surface of the stone causeway, and Pell, who had crossed this ford many times, leaned forward into the harness and pulled. The water was a foot deep over the stones, perhaps a little more in places. The brown water broke white around Pell's legs. The cart rocked. Owen, holding the reins, looked down at the water and at the line of the causeway and held the cart on the line. The crossing should have taken a minute, did not. I do not know, friend, how to explain to you what happened next. Owen could not explain it to me 50 years later. He could only tell me what he remembered, which is that the river became wider. That is the way he said it. The river became wider. He had crossed this ford 30 times. He knew it was 12 paces wide. He had measured it once as a child by walking the stones at low water, counting his steps. 12 paces. It was perhaps 13 at high water, where the bank was eaten back by the flood. He drove Pell across the water for what he was certain was 12 paces, and he was still in the middle of the river. He drove her for another 12, and he was still in the middle of the river. He drove her for what he could not count any more. A long time, several minutes, perhaps a quarter hour, he did not know, and the water around the cart was the same depth, the same brown, the same fast, cold pull of October runoff, and the line of the causeway under the wheels was the same line, and the river kept being there. The far bank, when he could bring himself to look up at it, did not seem closer than when he had started. Pell was beginning to tremble. Owen could feel it through the reins. He did not turn around. This is the part of the story that Owen had the hardest time telling. He told me that for the rest of his life. He could not entirely say whether what happened next was something he heard or something he understood without hearing. The man on the bales behind him began to speak, or began to make a sound that was like speaking. The sound was very low, and it was steady, and it was, Owen said, 50 years later, and stopped, and then said it again. It was the sound of a man counting slowly. Counting in some language Owen did not know, in numbers that were not the numbers he had grown up with, counting towards something. Owen, on the seat of the cart, in the middle of a river that should have been 12 paces wide, listening to the slow counting of the cold thing on the wool behind him, did the only thing he could think to do. He talked to Pell. He told her that she was a good horse. He told her that she had pulled through worse than this. He told her about a time, 3 winters before, when she had pulled the cart through snow up to her chest, when his father had thought she would not make it, but she had. He told her about the apple he had given her that morning at the inn at Bram-on-the-Stream. He told her that there would be apples at Dunhalle, that the wool factor's wife always had apples, that there would be a warm stable and oats and a rest. He told her that they were almost across. He told her that they were almost across. He told her that they were almost across. Pell, who had been trembling, settled. She did not stop. She kept pulling. The water broke white around her legs. The counting on the bales behind Owen continued. It was getting louder, or it was getting closer. Owen could not tell. He could feel now the cold draft of air on the back of his neck very strongly, as if someone was leaning forward toward him. He talked to Pell. He told her that he loved her. He had never said this aloud to a horse before. He told her that he had loved her since he was a boy, and she had been a young mare, and his father had let him hold the reins for the first time. He told her that she was the best horse in the upper valley. He told her, with tears in his eyes, and he told me in the tavern that he had been crying, although he had not noticed it at the time. He told her that whatever happened to him at this ford, she should run when she reached the far bank. She should run and not stop. She should go to Dunhalle by herself if she had to, and the wool factor's wife would know her and would feed her and would send word back to the village. He told her this clearly, with his hand on the rein and his voice steady, the way you tell important things to someone you love. And then, and this is the strange thing, friend, the strangest thing in a story full of strange things, Pell turned her head. She turned her head all the way around, the way a horse can sometimes do, and she looked at Owen. She looked at him with one large dark eye, and Owen saw in her eye that she had heard him, that she understood, that she would do what he had said. She turned her head forward again. She pulled. The far bank came up under the wheels of the cart. I will tell you what Owen told me. I will not embellish it. I will not invent. The cart came up onto the far bank. The wheels rolled out of the water and onto the dry stone of the road on the far side. Pell stepped forward onto the bank and shook herself, the way a horse does when it has been wet, and she kept walking. She did not stop. She did not need to be told. She kept walking up the road, away from the river, at her fastest pace, faster than she had walked all day, faster than she had walked in years. Owen, on the seat, did not turn around. He drove for a long time. He drove until the trees were thick on either side, and the river was out of sight behind him. He drove until Pell was lathered and her flanks were heaving, and he knew, as a carter knows, that he could not push her any farther without ruining her. He drove until he was a mile up the road from the ford, perhaps a little more, Hilda's mile. He remembered the mile she had told him to cover before stopping. And then he did stop, because he had to. He stopped the cart in a small clearing where the road widened. He sat for a long moment with his hands on the reins and his eyes on the road ahead. The light was very thin now. The sun was almost down. The trees were dark on either side. Then he did the thing he had been afraid to do for the last hour. He turned around. The bales of wool were behind him, stacked the way he had loaded them at his uncle's barn the evening before. They were tight. They were tied. They were exactly as they had been when he had left the village. The cart was empty. There was no man. There was no cloak. There was no wet patch on the bales. There was nothing on the wood of the cart bed that suggested anyone had ever sat there. Owen sat for a long time looking at the empty cart. He told me in the tavern 50 years later that there was one thing he noticed. The cart was lighter. He could feel it. Pell was pulling more easily than she had been pulling all morning, even though she was tired. The cart was, he said this, and I will say it the way he said it. The cart was a small amount lighter than it had been at the start of the day. Not much. Not so much that he could have weighed the difference, but a small amount. He never knew, he said, what had been taken. He drove on slowly. He reached the outskirts of Dunhalle in the full dark. The wool factor's wife, who was, as he had told Pell she would be, a kind woman with apples, gave him a bowl of stew and a place in the stable for Pell. And Owen unloaded the bales and counted them, and they were all there. And the wool factor's wife asked him if he was well, and he said yes. But he must have looked strange, because she gave him a second bowl of stew and a glass of cider that he had not asked for, and that she did not charge him for. He delivered the wool the next morning. The factor counted the bales and weighed them and paid him in coin. The weight was correct. The weight that was reported was the weight he had loaded, the same weight to the ounce. So whatever had been lost from the cart had not been wool. Owen drove back to the village by a different road. He went the long way, 2 extra days, around the headwaters of the small river, and he did not cross the ford at Wen. He did not tell his father why he had taken the long road. His father, who was a careful man and who had been a carter all his life, looked at his son when he came home and looked at Pell and asked if everything had been all right on the road. Owen said yes. His father looked at him for another moment, and then he said, "The pay was good." And Owen said yes. The pay had been good, and his father had nodded, and they had unharnessed Pell together in the small barn behind the house. And his father had said, in the way he said important things, "There are some roads, son, that you take once, and then you don't take them again. That's how it goes for some men. There's no shame in it." Owen had not said anything to that. He had only nodded. He never told his father what had happened at the ford. He never told his mother. He told no one in the village. He carried it. 3 years later, in the autumn after his 22nd birthday, Owen married a young woman from the next valley over named Tessa. She was the daughter of a small farmer, and she had a quiet way and a laugh that came up surprisingly when she found something funny, and Owen had loved her since they were both 15. They were married in the small stone church at his village, and there was cider after, and dancing, and Owen's father gave him the cart and Pell as a wedding gift, although by then the cart was already mostly his. They had a daughter the following autumn. They named her Me. She had her mother's quiet way and her father's slow, patient hands. When Me was 3 years old, Owen began to take on younger men to help him with the carting. The wool trade had grown. There were now 5 farms in the upper valley sending their bales to Dunhalle each October, and Owen alone could not handle them all. He hired his cousin Thomas first, and then a young man from Bram-on-the-Stream named Edwin, and then, 2 years later, a man named Hal who had come up from the south country looking for work. They were good young men. Owen paid them fairly. He worked beside them. He taught them what his father had taught him and what the road had taught him. He did not, however, let any of them cross the ford at Wen. He told them, when they took the road south to Dunhalle, that they were to take the long way. The long way was almost 2 extra days, around the headwaters of the small river. The young men complained sometimes. Thomas complained the most. He was a cousin, and he had grown up with Owen, and he did not see why his cousin had become so peculiar about a small ford on a small river that he himself had crossed many times as a boy. Thomas said more than once that he would just go through when the next time and save the 2 days, and Owen said more than once that if Thomas crossed at Wen, Thomas would not be carding for him anymore. Thomas, after a few of these arguments, stopped arguing. He took the long way. Owen never explained. The young men, in the way young men do, made up reasons among themselves. Some of them thought Owen had a creditor in the town near Wen whom he wanted to avoid. Some of them thought there had been a girl at Wen once, a girl Owen had loved who had married someone else, and the ford reminded him of her. Some of them thought it was just the eccentricity of an older man, the small, unreasonable thing every older man develops eventually, and they laughed about it quietly when Owen was not in earshot. They liked Owen. They thought he was a good master. They thought him peculiar about the ford, but no more peculiar than other older men they had known about other things. And they took the long way, and they joked, and the wool got delivered, and the years went on. Owen carded into his 50s, longer than most men in that work. He was steady, and his hands were strong, and Pell. He had several horses by then, but Pell was always the one he drove himself. Pell was the one he trusted on the road. When Pell finally died, in March of the year Owen was 53, he stopped driving the long-haul carts himself and turned the work entirely over to his men. He had 3 by then. Thomas had married and moved away. Edwin and Hal were still with him, and a younger man named Cobb had come on. They handled the trade. Owen lived, after Pell died, for another 19 years. He saw me married to a smith in the next valley. He saw 2 grandchildren born. He buried Tessa, who died of a fever one bad winter when Owen was 61. He carried, all of those years, the memory of one afternoon at one ford on one small river, and he did not speak of it to anyone, not to Tessa in their long marriage, not to me as she grew up, not to his men, not to his cousin Thomas before Thomas moved away, not to anyone who had known him before that afternoon, or anyone who had met him after. He told one person. The first person he told was a young priest who came to the village when Owen was 56. The priest was, Owen thought, perhaps 25, with a serious face and good ears for listening. Owen told him on a winter afternoon, in the small stone vestry behind the church, sitting on a wooden bench with the priest in another wooden bench across from him. He told him because he had thought, as he grew older, that he ought to tell at least one person who would understand what kind of thing it was. The priest listened all the way through. He did not interrupt. When Owen had finished, the young priest sat for a long moment with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on the stone floor of the vestry. Then the priest said, quietly, that he believed him. Owen said he was glad of that. He said he had never been entirely sure whether he believed himself. The priest said, after another long moment, that there were old books in the cathedral library at Dunhalle that mentioned things at Fords. He said he had read one of them when he was a student. He said the things at Fords were called by different names in different books, and that none of the names was certainly the right name, and that the books did not agree about what the things were, or where they had come from, or what they wanted. He said the books did agree on one thing. They agreed that the things at Fords were not, by their nature, evil. They were something else. They were, the books said, *waiting*. They were not actively malicious. They were something that had got caught in the rules of the world somewhere. The priest used a word Owen did not know, and then explained that it meant *snagged*, the way a piece of cloth gets snagged on a thorn, and that they were trying to get unsnagged, and that occasionally a traveler with a horse and a cart could help them, and that the help was not always free. Owen asked what the price was, usually. The priest said the books did not agree about the price. Some of them said it was a year of the traveler's life. Some of them said it was something the traveler had loved before the crossing and would not love after. Some of them said it was simply a memory, one specific memory the traveler did not know they were carrying, a memory the thing at the ford needed for some reason, and that the traveler would never miss because they would never remember they had had it. The priest said, looking at Owen carefully, that he hoped Owen's price had been a memory. Owen said he hoped so too. He told one other person after the priest, and that other person was me in the corner of the tavern when he was 70. By then the priest was long dead, and Owen had outlived all of his men, and he had outlived Tessa by 9 years, and he had no one left to tell except a stranger who would not be there in the morning. He told me what I have told you, friend. He told me about the road, and the wayside shrine with the blue wooden top, and the carter coming the other way with the apple smell, and Hilda at Bram on the stream, and the dream, and the morning of the third day, and the man on the stone, and the crossing that was not 12 paces wide. He told me about Pell, and the counting on the wool bales behind him, and what he had said to his horse in the middle of the river, and the way she had turned her head and looked at him with one large dark eye and understood. He told me about the empty cart on the far bank, and the cart being lighter than it had been at the start of the day, and the long ride into Dunhalle in the dark, and the wool being correct in the morning, and the long way home, and his father's quiet question in the barn. He told me at the end that he had thought about it almost every day for 50 years. Not in fear, not anymore, just in a kind of sober wondering. He had been an ordinary young man on an ordinary day, doing the ordinary work of his family for 3 generations, and he had stopped at a ford, and something had asked him for a kindness, and he had given it, and he had walked away changed. He said he did not know what had been taken. He said he had spent 50 years trying to find the place inside himself where it had been, and he had never found it. He said that was, perhaps, the kind of thing the priest had been talking about, a memory you did not miss because you did not remember you had had it. He said he was grateful, in some hard-to-describe way, that whatever had been taken had been small enough to leave him whole. He said he thought of the man on the stone sometimes, the long dark cloak, the deep hood, the patient stillness. He said he thought of him without bitterness and without fear. He said he hoped, and here he stopped and looked into his ale and was silent for a long moment. He said he hoped that, whatever had been waiting at that ford, what Owen had given it had been enough to let it go on. He said he hoped it was no longer there. He said he would never know. I asked him, when he had finished, whether he had ever found out what the man at the ford had been, whether he had ever asked old men in other towns, or read in old books, or been told by anyone in the long years of his life What kind of thing waits at fords for travelers with carts? He shook his head. He said that he had never asked beyond the priest, and that he did not want to know more. He said that some things were better left as questions. He said that what he had carried away from that afternoon was not knowledge, but, and this is the word he used, a asterisk sense asterisk. A sense, he said, that the world had more rooms in it than he had been told about, and that some of those rooms had things sitting in them, waiting, and that the doors to those rooms were sometimes places you walked past without thinking, and that his door had been a small ford on a small river that he had crossed 30 times before. He said that he was glad in the end that his door had been one of the kind ones. He said that he thought the man at the ford had been one of the kind ones by the standards of such things. He said that he thought there were others that were not. He said this, and then he drank the last of his ale, and he stood up slowly. He was old, and his bones hurt, and he wished me good night, and he walked out of the tavern into the dark, and I never saw him again. I do not know if Owen is still alive, friend. I have not been to that town in many years. He would be older now than is usual, even for a man as steady as he was, and I think he is probably gone. But I think of him sometimes, when the road I am walking comes down to a ford. There is one I cross often, in the eastern country, a small ford on a small river, with stone bottoms and clear water, and an old grey rock on the near bank that I have eaten my lunch on twice. I cross it. I do not sit on the rock. I do not, when I am crossing, look behind me. I do not stop on the far side until I am at least a mile up the road. I learned that from Owen. I learned it without ever having to test it. That is the kind of thing one learns from other people's stories, friend, if one is wise enough to listen. There is another tale about that country, about a different ford on a different river, and it is not a kind one. I will not tell it tonight. Some stories are for cold nights, and tonight is not cold enough. I think, friend, you are nearly asleep. The fire is good for some hours yet. There is dead beech enough on the north side of the trees to last us till dawn, and the wind has died, and the wood will burn slow. Lie down by the fire if you wish. Sleep. I will sit by the fire. I do not, on the nights I tell this story, sleep myself until dawn. I will keep the watch. Good night.